If you want to get people fired up, start a conversation about Gen Z in the workplace. I personally know this because so many of you offered your thoughts on this video where I discussed Gen Z getting fired in record numbers. Now, much of that conversation revolved around the traditional 9 to 5 grind. It's no secret that the 9 to 5, it doesn't have the best reputation anymore. It's being called modern slavery, outdated, a waste of time, or even the road to death. So if this were a Marvel movie, the 9 to 5 would be the villain. But did you know that it didn't start that way? It was actually the hero. Believe it or not, the 9 to 5 was actually a good thing when it was introduced, and everyone loved it. So is it possible that today we should love it too? So let's talk about where the 9 to 5 came from, why it was loved, why it was celebrated, and what it can mean for us today. Let's go. So whether you love it, you hate it, or you're somewhere in between, if we understand why work is the way it is, it can actually be helpful. So to understand why the 9 to 5 was a big deal, I want to go back in time for just a moment. Stick with me. Let's look at what work was like before it existed. See, during the Industrial Revolution in the 19th century, people worked insane hours. I'm talking 12, 14, 16 hours a day for 6 or 7 days a week. And when I say work, listen, I don't mean they sat in an air-conditioned office, scrolling on social media and pressing buttons on a computer. That's not to downplay your hard work, but this was hard physical work in labor mines and factories. They did monotonous jobs in dangerous work environments for little to no pay. And if that doesn't sound bad enough, the women and the children, well, they were employed under those same conditions because they could be paid significantly less than the men. This was called cheap labor. Now, many of the complaints I hear today are actually the same complaints that we heard back then. See if it matches. They literally had no time for their families, no time for social lives, no time for rest, and of course, work-life balance that we talk a lot about today, well, you can forget it. That didn't exist back then. So cue the "We're Not Gonna Take It" soundtrack, because in the late 1800s, this is where the shift started to happen. Workers started to push back. They began forming labor unions, and they demanded better working conditions, higher pay. They wanted shorter hours, and one of the biggest demands that everyone wanted was the 8-hour workday. In fact, the slogan 8 hours for work, 8 hours for rest, and 8 hours for what we will became the slogan for workers across the world. Now, you're not going to be surprised by this, but companies resisted it, and it took until the 20th century before any real progress was made. But it was actually the Ford Motor Company, the car guys, Ford, who first introduced the 8-hour workday for its factory workers and even doubled their pay to $5 a day. Now, Henry Ford, being the genius businessman that he was, he believed that well-rested and well-paid workers were more productive and less likely to quit. Plus, with more time and more money, his employees could actually afford to buy the cars that they were making, and it was a win-win for everybody. And Henry Ford was right. So by the 1930s, the U.S. government got involved, and they started stepping in to protect workers. So they developed the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938, and that gave everyone the 40-hour work week. And it even helped introduce overtime pay. See, this was a huge turning point for workers. Finally, the workers, they had rights. And I think this is something, honestly, that we take for granted today, which is why I think it's worth taking this trip back in time. See, the 9 to 5 represented freedom. So think about it. After decades of working 16-hour days for 7 days a week, they finally had predictable schedules and steady paychecks. For the very first time, they could count on evenings and weekends so they could spend it with their families, they could finally have a hobby, or just rest. It was a game changer. So the 9 to 5 that we complain about so much today actually gave them a quality of life. Now, I understand times have changed, things are different. I know that the 9 to 5 isn't perfect, but it does help to remember where it came from and why. And I personally think that even today, the principles that are behind the 9 to 5 still apply. It's fairness, boundaries, and respect for workers. So, what's the takeaway here? I know the 9 to 5 isn't the enemy. Let me just say that one more time. It's not the 9 to 5 that's the enemy. It's a little more complicated than that. But I know that the loudest voices are all against it, but just being loud and miserable doesn't do any good. So if you feel stuck in your 9 to 5, let me give you some advantages to think about. Because we have a lot of talk these days about gig work, about starting your own company, doing it for yourself, sticking it to the man, leaving the 9 to 5, all of these different things. But I want to give just some advantages of the traditional work setup that most of us think about and experience today. Not that it's going to solve all the problems, but I want to help encourage you and maybe just shift your mindset to some of the positives. The first would be predictability. Predictability. Most 9 to 5s have a pretty predictable schedule. So even if you don't like it, you at least know what it is. This allows you to plan for other parts of your life. I would argue that a 9 to 5 can still allow for a healthy balance between professional and personal life. Gig work, being your own employee, does not give you the ability to have predictability in your schedule. So like the 9 to 5 schedule that's consistent, predictable, pay is also predictable. So if your wage is X amount of dollars per hour and you work X number of hours, your pay would be, see, you can predict it. This gives a lot of people a peace of mind being able to predict their pay. And that's definitely something that gig work or working for yourself can't necessarily provide. The other benefit here is access to benefits like health insurance and paid time off, retirement plan. All of this helps to provide financial security. It's predictable. All of the other options for work, although they're attractive and they have their positives, they can't all provide the same level of predictability that you have with your traditional 9 to 5. Another one is opportunity. So lots of companies offer lots of opportunities for professional development and advancement even from within inside the company, giving you opportunities to grow where you're planted. Some of these companies that I work with, I know they offer mentorship programs, leadership training, workshops. They have online courses. They'll send you to conferences, help you get certificates or certifications. They provide tuition assistance. I mean, think about it. You can go back to school and your employer can pay for it. And there's tons of other benefits that you get from your 9 to 5. And if you're not aware of what they are where you're working, I would just say talk to someone, a manager, one of the leaders in the office, talk to HR, ask them what is available to you. Another benefit to encourage you with your typical 9 to 5 is stability. Stability compared to other employment options, especially self-employment. A traditional 9 to 5 job just offers security that others can't match. I know many people who thought the grass would be greener on the other side. So they quit their job. So they decided, I'm going to be my own boss. I'm going to do it my own way. And not long after, they soon realized the weight and pressure of that decision. See, when you lose the 9 to 5 stability, you realize that if you don't work, you don't eat. There is no paid sick days or paid vacation days. When you're working for yourself outside of your 9 to 5, you become the owner, you become the manager, the salesman, the serviceman, the secretary, the janitor, and everything else that's in between. The stability is completely determined by you. So if you value stability, your 9 to 5 can still provide that for you. So if you're struggling with your 9 to 5, I just want you to shift your perspective. Instead of seeing it as a trap, think of it as a tool. There are so many positives. Now listen, I know there's lots of negatives that come along with that as well. I'm not telling you that these things are enough to keep you where you are and to just take whatever it is that you're disgruntled about, but I am saying that a fresh perspective and your attitude shift just a little bit, maybe you can see that there are some advantages to the 9 to 5 that you're in. But I don't want to just talk about it myself. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Do you think the 9 to 5 is outdated, or do you think it still has a place in today's work world? Just drop a comment below and just let me know. I would love to hear what you have to say. And I would be honored as well if you would like, subscribe, and share this with someone who needs a fresh perspective on the 9 to 5 that they're in as well. So go bring meaning back to the marketplace, and I'll see you on the next one.